Good morning. Thank you for getting up early in this first seminar of the term. And yes, it is after Labor Day. So anyway, before I introduce our speaker, I just want to tell you a little bit about what's coming this year. We have a great lineup, and Dr. Kass was chosen to really showcase the lineup. She's a star in and of herself. You'll hear about that in a minute. But we have a great lineup, and you can see it on our website, hopefully. If not today, then when Renee gets back to update it next week. But I think you have a partial list at least. Just to tell you about it, our seminars are always, as you know, the first Wednesday of every month, starting at 8:30 and going till 9:30. Next week, Jay Herson and Elizabeth Sugar are hosting, next month, Arthur Hertz will be here from University of Utah. In November, Kathy DeAngelis will be talking about some of her experiences with conflict of interest at JAMA, where she was editor for 10 years. In November, we have also in November, we have two speakers in November because we have a special guest, Rob Califf from Duke, is going to speak over in Summer Hall about clinical trials and some of his experiences. December's Kevin Frick. January, Sheila West. February 6th, Joe Gallo is going to talk about mixing qualitative and quantitative methods in clinical trials. March, Scott Seeger is going to talk about Hopkins InHealth using the eHealth record. David Celentano in April. And to finish off the year in May, Sharon Lee Norman from Harvard is going to talk about aggregated data summaries for comparative effectiveness. So we have a great lineup, and I hope you'll all be there every month. And as you know, we meet in this room, but because it's a classroom, we're vulnerable to being kicked out. And if the past is any indication of what's going to happen in the future, there are two seminars in the third term, that is February and March, where we're kicked out. And we go to either 40-30 or 30-30, but stay tuned. Otherwise, as far as we know, we're in here for the year. Okay, so welcome to Nancy Kass, our first speaker of the seminar series for the year. She's the Phoebe Berman Professor of Bioethics and Public Health in the Department of Health Policy and Management and she's Deputy Director of the Berman Institute of Bioethics. So she's been working here for quite a while, since graduate. 20 years this summer since getting her PhD here, although she did take a brief sojourn to the World Health Organization Ethics Review Committee Secretariat, where she worked for a year in 2009 through 10. She received her bachelor's degree from Stanford and then did a postdoc at Georgetown in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Her research is mainly in the area of bioethics and health policy, as you might guess. Her publications primarily related to HIV/AIDS ethics policy. Among other things, Dr. Kass has co-chaired the National Cancer Institute Committee to develop recommendations and informed consent documents for cancer clinical trials, and she served on the NCI's Central IRB. There's lots else, but I want to give her time to talk about one of her latest projects. So, Dr. Kass.
Thank you, Taddy. It's great to be here. It's always nice to talk at Hopkins because there's familiar faces. And particularly for something like this, it's a chance for me to get feedback. I'm going to give you the background on this project and this work, which for the initial piece that I'll be presenting is sort of coming to an end. This is the results of work that Ruth Faden and I directed through an ARRA challenge grant that we got as part of the stimulus funding 2 years ago, and that grant is coming to an end. We've just gotten some funding from PCORI to do a little bit of follow-up work, and we've got this grand plan of a lot more follow-up work, but I feel like we still haven't had enough feedback on this first part. And so I was excited about the chance to talk about this with you and get some feedback and reactions. So what I want to do is tell you who our team is, tell you what we were trying to do in this project, and then launch into the ideas that we're trying to play with as we have been moving forward. So you'll recognize probably most of the faces on here, maybe not all. So Ruth Faden on the left, I hope most of you know, she's the director of our Berman Institute of Bioethics. Dear colleague of mine, she was my doctoral advisor. And it was really fun for me to have to work collaboratively with Ruth again on a project. We hadn't done that in a long time. Peter Pronovost in the middle, I also imagine a lot of you know he's the patient safety guru, not only at Johns Hopkins, but really increasingly globally. And again, for those of you who at all follow some of these ideas, Peter not only is himself incredibly thoughtful about ethics and the ethics of research, but had a sort of hot water situation when one of his projects became the subject of an OHRP investigation. And how many of you know what I'm talking about, this whole Michigan checklist study and the brouhaha that followed from it? Maybe half of you. Okay, well, I may talk about it a little bit. Sean Tunis on the right does comparative effectiveness research. I should say in full disclosure, because some of you know some of us, this is a project of 6 people. And Tom Beecham, bottom left, how many people know Tom Beecham? A few of you. Probably, I really would say one of the forefathers of bioethics. Any of you who've ever taken a bioethics class and used a book called Principles of Bioethics, Beecham and Childress, that's Beecham, Tom Beecham. He's a professor of philosophy at Georgetown. He was one of the authors of the Belmont Report. Anybody heard of the Belmont Report? So the folded, and then our dear friend and colleague in the bottom right-hand corner, who when we started this was at Johns Hopkins, Steve Goodman, now Vice Dean at Stanford. So the full disclosure part, which I do not say to all audiences, but among the 6 of us who I really would continue to argue were put together because it was the right team for the project. Ruth and Tom are married. Sean and I are married. Peter and Steve are not married. But it was a bit of an incestuous group, but we continued, I will say we went through this little personal ethical dilemma as we were writing the grant, as Ruth and I were writing the grant, saying, do we somewhere write in here that we're married to doing the investigators? Do we have to disclose that? Anyway, the long and short of it was we didn't, but it occupied much too much conversation as we were writing the grant. So when we were writing, so let me give you a little bit more background and then I'll launch into what we were trying to do. Part of the background is that both Ruth and I have worked for a long time as part of our career interests in ethics of human research. I do work in both the United States and in Africa. Ruth and Tom wrote one of the best existing texts on informed consent, the history and theory of informed consent. Ruth chaired the advisory committee on human radiation experiments. So we've had this longstanding interest in what it really means to ethically conduct research with human subjects. We're both trained in research. We both conduct our own research and have very deep commitments to this area. As we observed the research world changing, and particularly the clinical research world changing, you don't have to look very deeply to realize that there become a lot more questions about when is a particular activity that is occurring in the clinical context, research versus practice. And certainly part of what was going on in Peter Pronovost's Michigan study raised questions about you're doing certain things in the clinical setting. Many of those things would have been happening anyway. Many of the things you're trying to evaluate are things that ought to have been going on anyway. You are systematically measuring whether those things that ought to have been happening not only are indeed really happening, but whether when they really happen, the outcomes improve. And it does start to raise these blurry questions about what is research and what is practice. We decided in this project to take on the blurry zone between research and practice, particularly in 2 contexts, quality improvement and comparative effectiveness research, which was part of the reason we put this team together. And we wanted to do a lot of scholarly work on sort of how did we get to where we are? Why did we end up with the particular research ethics infrastructure that we have? And then moving forward, as the world continues to have what I'll call this blended, overlapped context of research and practice occurring simultaneously and deliberately occurring simultaneously, how ought we think about ethical protection and ethical good going forward when we deliberately want to integrate learning into clinical contexts? So here's a little bit of background that sort of we think, I don't think this is rocket science, set us up for why now the blurriness becomes so complicated and challenging. I'm going to guess that this crowd knows that in the 1970s, for the first time, the United States published this thing called the Belmont Report and got federal regulations governing human subjects research. So this idea that all of our human research has to go to an IRB happened through the passing of congressional act in the 1970s and all the regulations that followed. So since we got these regulations in the United States, there's been a lot of scholarly attention, a lot of literature on ethics and human research. And there was a landmark study that I still teach in my research ethics class here, published in 1985 by Paul Applebaum and Chuck Litz and a few other people, that demonstrated that patients who go into clinical trials often don't understand that they're in research. They're getting treatment in their clinical trial, and they sort of don't get it that research is going on and not clinical care. And there are some really dramatic and revealing quotes that come out of the study that was published in 1985 of people saying things like, well, I think my doctor likes me, so I'm sure I'm getting the good thing. And it's really important work. They coined this term, the therapeutic misconception, which again, I'm guessing some of you have heard before. And it's this idea that we ought to have great ethical concern about the fact that some patients, when they go into research, mistakenly think they're getting medical care when we really know they are in a research study. There was enormous attention, a lot of grants, devoted to how we can avoid this ethical landmine, this ethical pitfall that patients are going to mistakenly think they're getting medical care when they are in a research study. And then what followed from that, from a lot of the bioethics people and particularly philosophers, is conceptually, how is research really different from practice? And I despite where I'm going, I certainly don't want to suggest that research and practice are the same thing at all. But even the conceptual work set us up for when we start to reintegrate some challenges, I think. So the literature has said research and treatment not only are conceptually distinct, but must be kept conceptually distinct in terms of what we then owe the people who participate. So Bob Levine, probably some people know, again, one of the real fathers of research ethics, wrote a textbook on clinical research, said the term therapeutic research is both unacceptable terminology and, he said, illogical. There cannot be something that is therapeutic research, Bob Levine said. Frank Miller, some of you may know at the NIH, and Howard Brody wrote in another article that got a lot of attention, sound ethical thinking about research depends on a basic distinction between research and therapy. And so then one of the things that we did in our project, when we counted recently, there were about 30 meetings when Tom, Ruth, Sean, Peter, Steve, and I got together, and we were hashing a lot of this out. What we must have spent a good part of our first year doing was trying to both read the literature and articulate through our own experience and conversations, how do we think people have described research as being distinct from practice? What are the elements? What are the features that distinguish research? And through this combination of our own thinking and things we've heard or things we've been told by IRBs and a huge amount of reading of the literature in this area, we came up with, in our paper, there are actually 5 things because there's some overlap here with the uncertainty one, but they're grouped here into 4. So one is, there's a lot of literature that says in research, there is external control of the situation. And even the federal regulation of research talks about a systematic investigation. There's this idea that there's a method, right? And that's part of what we teach our students. There is a method. What obviously you can be thinking about foreshadowing is, is it really true that practice has none of these things? Because the point of these conceptual distinctions is to be able to identify for all of us out there, well, this is research. That's the bracketed stuff. And in my world, that's the stuff you've got to send to the IRB. All the practice world doesn't have to go to the IRB. So part of the one element in the literature says in research, there's external control of a clinical situation, either in what medications the patient gets or in how care occurs more broadly, how the system is organized. There's a manipulation of the environment or of clinical choices. There's a protocol. Whereas I will say the traditional narrative goes, in medical care, there is the autonomy of the physician and or physician-patient dyad to make the decisions they want. This whole idea of get government off my back, I'm a doctor, comes out of what I'll call this traditional narrative that in the clinical setting, in the pure clinical setting, there's pure autonomy. In the research setting, there is pure protocol. Also in research, there's systematic collection of data. And again, this is part of the federal definition of this is how you can spot research. There's systematic collection of data, whereas in the traditional narrative, and maybe this was true 60 years ago, I think we all can point pretty quickly to the fact that we'd be stretching the truth if we said this today. In practice, documentation is only in the individual chart. Research is where there's uncertainty. Research, you're trying to learn something new. You're trying to prove something. So there is uncertainty. In our paper, we separate uncertainty and benefit. But fundamentally, there is uncertainty about whether this intervention you're giving a patient works or not, or whether it works better than the other thing. Whereas once we have certainty, that becomes clinical care. Right. So again, the paradigm is when we don't know if a medicine works, we do research. When we know if it works, it's clinical practice. And then research, and this is the great line that is articulated in more places in the literature than anything else, is research is when there's an intent to produce generalizable knowledge, which incidentally, thanks to some incredible research assistance, is very poorly ever explained. It's one of those, oh, you know what we mean. But it is stated over and over again. It was reproduced in international ethics guidelines. It's certainly part of the U.S. Guidance. Whereas in practice, the intent is to help the patient before you. And again, I'm going to show this slide a little later after I've gone through a little more, but I imagine I don't really have to convince this crowd that there's pieces of this that are probably going to be harder and harder to stand by, of like practice has none of these things. So research regulations, which we got in the 1970s, depend on being able, like any regulations, to which activities do these regulations apply? So they had to define research, and we as the community who are, if you will, the subject, the target of these regulations, have to know when we need to follow the regulations, which activities we're engaged in need to go to the IRB and which ones don't. So research regulations and all the research ethics guidelines rely on being able to draw a distinction between, if not research and practice, research and non-research. And the distinction is the main basis for identifying what has to go to the IRB, and in many cases what needs informed consent. Those are not synonymous, but informed consent, it's a funnel, and there's the world of activities with human beings, and then some of them have to go to the IRB, and of those, some of them need informed consent. So the aim of our work was to challenge the view that this distinction and all the things that rely on it, that the distinction ought to be the basis of what gets ethical oversight and what doesn't get ethical oversight, makes sense. As, again, to foreshadow, you will see that we increasingly argue that there are other things that ought to determine which activities get ethical oversight and not, rather than some definition of research versus non-research. And we tried to make the case through our work that there were practical problems with this distinction, conceptual problems, and moral problems as well. So practical problems, complete confusion. And one of the things that we did as a piece of this work was a small amount of empirical data collection. We did focus groups with, in this case, professionals in the field. So with quality improvement, quality assurance officers for hospitals, comparative effectiveness researchers, people who live in this space of quality and comparative effectiveness from a lot of different walks of life. And we had some amazing quotes come out of it. I have only, I think, 2, maybe 3 that I'm showing you, but again, maybe it ought not be a surprise that people reinforce this idea that, yes, it's a mess out there. we're trying very hard to do our best and figure out what needs to go to the IRB and what doesn't need to go to the IRB. And honestly, it's a mess. So conscientious IRBs, very experienced IRBs, are deciding these cases very differently from each other. And it's hard even for experienced IRBs to give good guidance. As a little anecdote that Peter Pronovost told me very recently, so Peter spends his life doing quality improvement, patient safety work, trying to reduce medical errors, trying to change systems. Not always, but often, like with his Michigan study, trying to figure out what I'll call behavior modification strategies for getting clinicians to do what evidence has already said is the right thing, for them to do this more consistently, and then measure in the end of a month whether there were fewer infections, fewer falls, fewer medication errors, whatever it is. And so that he does walk this fine line between quality and research all the time in his work. He would be the first to say, I'm doing research. I am a researcher. I systematically want to know if what I'm doing is better. But of course, I'm doing it in the context of clinical care. And I absolutely believe that in most of these cases, the patient outcomes will be better and there's no harm to them that's likely to come from this. But as he's had all these back and forths with the IRB, apparently they recently said to him, look, you figure out what you need to send to us and then we'll review it. And it's like, well, that's one system, but Peter's a great guy. I would trust him more than I would trust almost anybody on the face of the earth. But to the extent to which third-party review is supposed to avoid conflicts, it didn't solve that problem. So here's a couple quotes from our focus groups. The underlying assumption in our IRBs is that if there's anything that interrupted the physician-patient relationship to any degree, then we have to have full patient-informed consent. And usually when you get to that informed consent level, the overhead for doing it becomes so heavy that people will drop it. So I think there's two key ideas here. One is the whole ethics infrastructure is a real deterrent to learning. Well, that's an ethical problem. And if there's ways, and if it's misplaced ethical oversight, it's what we would call a moral problem. Also, this idea that if you in any way change the physician-patient relationship, you need informed consent. Again, I'm a little bit foreshadowing, but what about evidence-based guidelines? What about funding formularies that say you can only do this and not that, or you can only have the mammogram every 2 years? Well, I mean, you can argue that that's interfering with the doctor-patient relationship at least as much as a computer that is popping up that there might be a medication error. So this was the end of a long story about a particular study learning activity, where the person concluded by saying, I don't think the IRB really cared that much about whether you randomize or not, because they described this long scenario of just following two different groups and then systematically introducing the intervention and then randomizing it through a long process at their institution. So he's saying, I don't think in the end the IRB was going to say they needed to review it based on whether the groups were randomized. I think their focus was really on, are you planning on publishing it, or do you think you might publish it in the future? And again, for people like me in our world, I have heard this line several times of, oh, if you're going to publish it, it needs to go to the IRB. And I have to say, from an ethics perspective, that is about as ludicrous as anything on the face of the earth. It's like, I get it why that's a good surrogate marker. But conceptually that I might publish it is why people need oversight, assuming it has nothing to do with identities and privacy, just doesn't, I don't mean to sound snarky when I sometimes have raised my hand in a group like that and I say, like, book reviews. I mean, I don't mean to sound silly, but it points to that this can be very silly. So here's this next quote I have to say I love, and I have shown a couple times at meetings just to demonstrate that, smart people come up with solutions to the blurriness problem. So this guy, who is a member of the focus group, said, our patient safety group is funded out of a medical care budget at our institution. The institution has a separate research budget. He's saying, I'm in the quality medical care group. So we never have to call anything we do research. So we never call it research. We have like research centers, but we call them centers of inquiry. If we send out a form for people to fill out, we call it a questionnaire, not a survey, because a survey has a certain kind of feel of epidemiology to it. A questionnaire doesn't, And literally, this is how they've solved it at his institution. So now this is where I'm putting this slide back up of, again, I'm not going to go through the argument of why each of these does not stand for uniquely defining research, because I'm assuming that this crowd probably can see that. But anybody who's interested in more substantiation why my colleagues and I think that these don't serve to uniquely define research, I'd be happy to get into that in more conversation. So that's part of the it's a mess out there, practical concern. And then part of what this leads us to is that, well, then that means there's also a conceptual problem, right? Conceptual work is the kind of thing that, philosophers spend years doing, but it's sort of, I will tell you what a table is. Here are the features of a table. And once I've described that, you really know what a table is. And other things are not a table. And everything that meets that definition is a table. And that's what conceptual thinking is supposed to be about. It defines things uniquely. It separates things. And to the extent to which there's been all this work saying, here are the conceptual features of research, well, it doesn't really work. And maybe it once did before we had electronic medical records, before things were as embedded. Who knows? That was not really the question we took on. It seems like at very least now it doesn't work. This is a slide on just an example of one of those features and how the systematic piece doesn't really hold water. But again, I imagine you know that healthcare is just rampant with systematic data collection. I don't remember the statistics about the number of people who are likely to see your chart, but obviously it's not just your doctor. And there is mandatory aggregation of data. If hospitals in the United States want to get any kind of Medicare reimbursement, they have to demonstrate that they're keeping track of a wide variety of quality indicators. All of that is the systematic collection and aggregation and analysis of data. And for this idea of generalizable knowledge, much of that, the reason why Medicare and a lot of other places require hospitals to keep track of data is in order to generalize and learn for the sake of others. If it turns out that your rate of falls or infections or anything else is bad, you're supposed to do something and improve it, and that's obviously for the sake of others, not for the patient where there was a problem. And then moral problems with the current approach of depending on what meets a research definition as the source of what gets ethical oversight, and no ethical oversight whatsoever for things that don't fit into that box, leads to, and we again had a lot of discussion about this among our project team, what we would call overprotection and underprotection. So there is, and again, I'm sorry that Steve Goodman is not here because he can talk about this for a very long time, but there are just stunning statistics on the amount of medical care that is provided where we don't have good evidence. And that's where you might say there is underprotection. And I don't mean by that I'm arguing that every single time that a medical treatment is recommended where there isn't good evidence that an IRB should be there. But I'm trying to point out that if the whole point of ethical protection is to ensure that patients' welfare and interests are taken into account when people do things with uncertainty, we're not quite hitting the nail on the head. And there really is, again, this extraordinary amount. Yeah, Jim.
If you consider lack of quality of care in the same bailiwick?
Yes, absolutely.
So that kind of falls under this underprotection.
Yes, and actually another...
So it's not just that.
It's not just that we don't yet know.
The specific practice is not been evaluated for efficacy. That some practices specifically don't follow good quality guidelines and practice it appropriately.
Absolutely. There are many components of this, so I'm really glad you raised that. I would also say one of the other features, which is a little bit less prominent, so it wasn't on that slide, but it comes up again in our paper, that people use to characterize research is that there are additional burdens that we ask participants to take on that are not needed for their clinical management. And again, that is absolutely true in research. I know that, right? I do that to patients. I ask them to fill out extra questionnaires that are simply for the sake of research. The flip side, though, that everything that occurs in medical care, the assumption that follows from that everything that happens in medical care is necessary for their clinical management, the default that patients are led to believe, also gets raised. And in certain ways, there's all the care that has never been evaluated. There's the lack of quality, which is even for things we know are the right or wrong ways to practice, people aren't doing them. And then there's the extraordinary amount of overutilization, whether it's through a logistical thing, like I go for a second opinion and they just want to repeat all the x-rays, or the times when you're sent for all sorts of stuff that you don't need, that are, we would argue, the parallel, if we're trying to make this case, that the stuff you said happens in research also happens in care. So I'm glad you raised that. And then overprotection. And again, I imagine particularly in this crowd, or those of you who've maybe not even in the clinical trials word, but done a lot of what I'll call sort of straight epi studies, might find some of this familiar, that there's times you have to go through this extraordinary IRB apparatus for things that you're pretty confident are really low risk and are not threatening the lives, interests, and welfare of the people involved very much. And again, we've sort of all gotten used to that system, and institutions try really hard to make it more efficient so it's less burdensome on us. But fundamentally, I, for one, would stand by, and I imagine most people would, that there are certain kinds of activities out there where another person should take a little look-see, and sometimes a whole committee should, but I'm not sure that we're, pointing the light at the right set of activities. So, okay, so now that's sort of looking backwards. Now let's start looking forwards. So what we wanted to do, we started with a huge assumption, which again, maybe at Johns Hopkins I don't need to convince people of, but we start with this huge assumption that learning is a good thing, and that learning is going to be facilitated by its deliberately being integrated into clinical contexts. And again, I'm sure everybody has their own anecdote, but you only have to go to the doctor once or twice to have them say, we really don't know if this thing we're recommending, you go in with your back pain and they really don't know whether the surgery is going to make a difference or the physical therapy. And you think, my God, my mother was asking these same questions 40 years ago, that you think, gosh, it's really a shame that so much ordinary medical practice is not captured. We could be so much further if we had been systematically learning from everyday practice all the way along. And so we certainly started with a view that learning is a good thing, and that learning will be expedited and facilitated by being much more continuously integrated into ordinary clinical care settings. And we also said we not only want an ethical frame that allows that and facilitates that, because it is itself an ethical good. If part of the whole idea of the enterprise is to have good outcomes, look to the welfare of the patients, but also absolutely, and I guess I hope I can say, of course, that the learning proceeds in an ethically acceptable fashion, which means we have to define what the heck we mean by that. So we started on that journey and had to define what body of activities we're talking about. And we said we're thinking about the context where healthcare services are being delivered, or where individual information that emerged from those healthcare services was produced, and that has the targeted objective of learning how to improve something, like the quality of care, the value of care, the efficiency of care, or the fairness and improved access to healthcare systems and institutions. So that's the context. We didn't squarely take on what I will call public health ethics and public health delivery, where comparable questions emerge about what's research and what's surveillance and that kind of thing, although we imagine that some of this thinking will apply, but we limited ourselves to the healthcare delivery context and the data that emerged from that. So fast forward a year and a half, and here's what we came up with, and I have a slide on each of them, and then I'm going to stop for some discussion. So we said, going forward, an ethics framework for learning, for a learning healthcare system, ought to be undergirded by 7 duties. And some of them will sound really familiar to you, and some of them maybe less so. So the activity must be conducted in a way that is respectful to the patients. That doesn't always mean that patients have to know what's going on, and we can talk more about that if you want, but things can be done in ways that are respectful and things that can be done in ways that are not respectful, and it's a duty to be respectful. And that carries a bunch of very particular obligations that derive from it. There's a duty, and again, these are all what in the ethics world we call prima facie duties on its face. Each of these, sort of like the 10 Commandments, Each of them is supposed to stand. There will be times when they start to conflict and you have to decide which one will have priority. But on its face, each of these is independently important. Respect the judgment of clinicians. That's an ethical duty. It's important for all sorts of reasons to have a system that tries very hard to respect the ethical, the judgment of clinicians, the independent judgment. There is an ethical duty to provide each patient with optimal clinical care to the extent to which we know what that is. So this builds on some of the old things in the Declaration of Helsinki that says, even if the scientific question is really important, you can't muck around with the welfare of the patient in front of you. You can't say, hey, I'm not going to treat your diabetes for a couple of years just to see what happens, right? Again, it sounds so obvious to us because we've lived in this world for a long time, but it was important to articulate. There is a duty to avoid imposing non-clinical risks and burdens on people. Again, none of this means you never do it, but you have to be motivated like that. And again, so many pragmatic trials now that are moving increasingly to say maybe you don't need to have people come in for the extra blood pressure reading. We'll get more learning to come out of it in the end. And we, again, impose less of a burden is related to that. Those four maybe will look more familiar. The last three maybe will look less familiar. A duty to address unjust health inequalities. This exists in the literature. It doesn't really appear in any documents, but this is saying this is a bit more into the meta enterprise. But as we go forward and choose our research questions in this learning healthcare system, those that are likely to reduce unjust inequalities rather than exacerbate them ought to have priority. There's a duty to conduct continuous learning activities, and this in part translates into clinicians ought not be able to opt in or opt out whether they're a collaborator on this. For things that do not impose very many burdens on them, if they're asked to have a very small part so that 40 years later we know which of these back pain interventions really makes a difference, if we're asking them to marginally increase a responsibility so that in the end there's this tremendous learning that really can't take place without their doing this small thing, there is a duty. And in parallel, and this is the one where I am anticipating we're going to get the most pushback, there is a duty on all of us when we are patients, when we are citizens, when we are consumers, to contribute to this common purpose of improving the quality and value of clinical care, which means as patients and families, to the extent to which it's not thought of to be a big threat to our interests or a threat to our clinical well-being or doesn't impose a lot of extra burdens, we have a duty to participate. So I'm going to go through them really quickly, mostly building on what I just said, and then I'm going to stop and really eager to get your feedback. So I think what the research ethics infrastructure we've lived with for the last 40 years has done, or maybe one thing that it's done, is to teach us that it's really important to respect patients or participants, and a way we do that is informed consent. And I think both of those things are true. What is also true, and we know this from our ordinary lives as human beings who go through the universe, is that not every decision or every activity is of equal moral importance to us. There are certain decisions I want to be involved in and certain decisions I don't. And I don't mean, oh, I'll defer my treatment to my doctor because I can't figure it out. I mean, whatever. I go to the doctor for an annual exam and they say to me, okay, we're now going to do your blood pressure and weight. And nobody stops and says, let me tell you why we think it's important to take your blood pressure every year. It's really up to you. And part of that is that I guess they think it's so important, but part of it is there's certain decisions where there's an assumption that there's moral relevance to me having a voice and other ones where there isn't. The other thing is that duties of respect go well beyond autonomous decision making. And I think in research ethics, we've led people to think about informed consent so consistently that we forget that there's so much that has to do with how people who leave a doctor's office or a research encounter feel that has nothing to do with informed consent. And it has significantly to do with the ordinary ways that human beings interact with each other. There's one study I did years ago with healthy volunteers, and one of the biggest predictors of whether they came back to an institution was how nice the nurse was who spoke with them. And again, sometimes people giggle when I say that, but boy, if I'm going to go back to a doctor or not, a lot of it has to do with how respectful they were to me, nothing to do with informed consent. And that kind of stuff becomes really important. There's lots of ways that this can play out. So this one is really complicated, and we spent a lot of time talking about this, that there is indeed this sort of a priori ethical duty to respect clinicians' judgment. There really is a reason why we go to doctors and don't go to an algorithm to get our medical care. And that's really authentic. And at the same time, a push from the other side is this idea that as we honor this obligation, there is so much evidence that clinicians' judgments can be biased, can be less than fully informed. Some of the stuff that Jim was saying about quality, you go to the doctor. So this is not straightforward, but I would argue that there remains an ethical duty to trust the judgment of physicians with a bunch of overlay built in.
Nancy?
Yeah.
I don't get this one at all.
Okay.
I don't see that it fits in with all the rest of them. You could say the same thing as, shouldn't we respect the administrator's judgment? I mean, the system is a big piece of things. There's lots of people that are engaged.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we respect housekeeping judgment? Shouldn't we? All sorts of stuff, and all sorts of people are engaged in this. I don't think there's a duty in any way, shape, or form to respect the clinician's judgment unless they're behaving appropriately. You know, we can respect and acknowledge their training, but it doesn't seem to me that there's a duty to respect their judgment necessarily. A duty.
Yeah.
Moral.
Yeah. So I hear what you're saying. So I think there's two pieces. One is the role of the physician any different from housekeeping and the administrator? And I would argue, since a piece of this has to do with patient well, so you could make an argument to me and we could have a really interesting discussion about whether what the administrator puts in place has as much impact on the patient's well-being as what the doctor does, and maybe that's true. I do think that there's a particular role that the doctor plays, but that's sort of addressing question one of, are they any different from other people with other role responsibilities in a clinical setting? The second thing of, given this problem that we know that sometimes doctors are practicing without full evidence, with bias, with, well, the last patient this worked for, so I'm going to give it to everybody else. Should we still respect that? I believe that that physician judgment in a lot of ways does make a difference. And there is an importance to putting that into the puzzle. Now, again, I want to go back to what I'm saying of, there's nothing about any of these that is intended to trump other considerations. It's not saying, so when you get to this point of tension where the evidence says you shouldn't be doing that and the doctor says, I want to, that there's a duty to override in favor of the doctor's recommendation. But it's saying, it is morally relevant to patients' welfare what a doctor thinks is right.
But isn't that taken care of by the next one?
It could be. It could be.
I mean, isn't that whole category argument actually captured in your next obligation?
It could be. It could be. So I see what you're saying, and obviously one of the reasons you do this is for the sake of the net clinical benefit. So I totally see that.
Clinical care is the judgment of a well-experienced and
yeah.
And that's perfectly appropriate and reasonable.
Yeah.
But number two seems to make an obligation to us, to the physician, when in fact the purpose of the system is to serve the patient. Yeah. Right?
I hear you.
I don't just doesn't make it.
All right, there's a lot of people want to jump in here.
I just said, I think society has said that we accept that there is a person who has the biggest obligation, professional role, and probably knowledge of integrating all the data and evidence that applies to this patient, whether they do it well or whatever it is, a statistical issue. But I do think from respecting persons, from the aspect of respecting persons, the clinician who takes on, who has been invested by society with that role, does have a bit of a different moral and ethical stance than any other client should.
I'm not arguing that.
No, but
the question is it a moral obligation
because
because
society hasn't put that role. If society had not said these professionals have a specific role, then there would be no moral obligation. role is something of a social construct, is it not?
So you can't ask the question if that's the appropriate paradigm?
I'm sorry?
So that precludes the question of whether or not what you just posed is even the appropriate paradigm?
No, but it allows us the opportunity to define it in certain ways.
I'm just raising that, I'm trying to put I hear what you were saying, trying to put it into the ethical construct of persons in society.
Because it seems like a lot of what you presented in the first part of your talk is premised on orienting toward the physician as the important party in this, as opposed to toward the patient. Even the research, if the research is aimed at trying to improve the care of the patient, then the patient becomes the center of the activity.
Well, so this is really helpful, and I want to move along a little bit only because through a little chit-chat, anecdotal conversation yesterday, getting to number 7 about the duty of patients to participate, a different angle on this came up as a question with our framework about whether imposing a duty on patients makes this not sufficiently patient-centered. That it's imposing a duty rather than framing it as, well, rather than emphasizing much more the reciprocal relationship that comes about through participation, and that essentially it is in our self-interest to be part of this, which is part of the point we're trying to make. But if somehow you put these things together and it comes across that we're just putting other people on pedestals, telling patients things they have to do, our view behind this is so deeply motivated by what is good for the patients and what's good for all of us. I mean, Ruth and I come from a public health background, but what's good for us collectively, and it's our view that all of this leads to that vision. But if that's not how it's coming across to other people, then that's part of the feedback that we need.
It seems to be built on the premise that the physician-patient relationship is inviolate, and that you have to work within that paradigm.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm cutting you off. I'm also going to be sensitive to time, but let me say something about that. I want to reiterate that the fact that something is on here doesn't mean that it has preeminence, but it means it has ethical relevance and ethical value. Now, that doesn't mean inviolate is a word I would never use with any of the 7. And in the same way, and I don't mean to sound silly, that in the 10 Commandments and in ethics we sometimes refer to that because that's something people are familiar with. Thou shalt not kill is sometimes, well, it depends whether the other thing is what the other duties are and what you've got the person in your basement and all that kind of thing. It has absolute moral relevance, and we are saying that. We are saying that the patient-doctor relationship is morally important and ought to be respected, and there can be some real value there, and the doctor may know better than anyone else what my wishes and values are that the doctor can help to promote when recommending certain kinds of care rather than others. But that's very different from being inviolate, or that it's more important than some of these other things that we start to get to, like addressing injustice in healthcare and ensuring continuous learning. So let me keep going, and we'll see where we get with the end of it. So this one, I think, sort of stands on its own, that there are duties, and again, this exists to some degree, that we're used to, of avoiding imposing other non-clinical risks and burdens inside of a learning activity compared to outside. And then will the learning activity exacerbate unjust inequalities or decrease them? And this says that there's a duty to structure both the enterprise of what our priorities are as we set out to ask questions in a given year about which we will learn. And even within a broad question, what the particular populations are that we include, or where we start our work to advance the goal of reducing unjust inequalities in healthcare. And then there are these last 2 parallel ones, which are duties on the clinicians to be part of the enterprise and duties on patients and families to be part of the enterprise. And again, I feel confident in saying we all feel very strongly about this, but I don't know if they are convincing yet the way we have put them forward. So healthcare professionals and the officials of institutions have an obligation to conduct and contribute to learning activities that advance these various goals of a learning healthcare system, the quality, fairness, and economic viability of the healthcare system. And it's rooted in role-specific opportunities available to healthcare professionals to achieve these, that there are certain, given the role that doctors and administrators of healthcare systems play, if they don't play along, a lot of this enterprise can't work. So they have a very particular role and they have to be part of it. And each activity should be assessed to determine the level of contribution. And then patients have this parallel one derived both from the norm of common purpose, which is we're all in this enterprise together. And if you don't play along and you don't play along to have your data from when you went to the doctor about your back pain be part of the database, then 10 years later or 20 years later when your friend or your neighbor or your kid comes along, well, we still won't know what to recommend. Importantly, it doesn't mean that patients have an obligation to participate in all activities, and some that are more burdensome or more risky, and plenty of traditional research activities that we used to call research and placebo-controlled trials are all going to be part of this under this big umbrella, and those are going to be really different in terms of the kind of conversation and voluntariness we present to patients. But there's plenty of other stuff where we want to make sure that patients are part of it much more routinely. So I think I'm going to stop there, and we'll have at least 10 minutes for questions. Yeah, Taddy.
So I want to go back to that number 2, because number 2 and number 6 were the ones that just jumped out at me as maybe show all.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yep.
Make it easier to talk about.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Because, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Jim was saying, because, just having heard coming in the ad of a physician who has some magic juice that'll make you well if you come to his practice, it's like, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't. And so, and I don't respect all studies just because they're done, or all electronic databases just because they exist. There's an obligation, an ethical obligation, if you undertake research or undertake collecting data that's going to be used to do that well. And number 6 is also very passive. They have to conduct learning activities. They don't have to learn. So there is part of 2 and 6, it seems to me, should be, I'll respect the judgment as long as you do your part, which is stay up to date and take information from well done research, as well as using judgment and experience and the opinions of your patients. And to me, this is not patient-centered, and I really have trouble with 2 and 6.
I guess I'd be happier about 2 if you put it in the context of the diet instead of the judgment of the clinician, because the judgment of the clinician isn't the only thing that affects the process of care, right? It's that relationship and that decision, that joint decision-making process. Now, sometimes it's not so joint, we all know that, but there is a joint decision-making process between patients and their clinicians.
So let me stop you there and ask you whether you would push you on that just to get feedback. If number 2 were framed as respect the preferences of the clinician-patient diet, the patient-clinician diet, and we all know there are plenty of times when the patient and clinician together want something that the insurance company isn't going to cover, right? This happens all the time in real life right now, and it conceivably might happen in the future in a system that had even more evidence behind it. And again, nothing says that when we put respect there that it trumps, but it's saying it's an important consideration, don't just blow it off. Would that make you feel better? Because there still could be just as much error bias. It could be that the patient says, I wanted magic juice, and the patient, so you can fairly quickly make a modification to who's the subject of the obligation piece. There's still this other question that I'm hearing about, well, what if the whole system is flawed?
Well, in that sense, I would just, it seems to me, if this is the framework for the learning healthcare system, then eliminating 2 doesn't do you any harm at all. That the system, of which a part are clinicians, are licensed clinicians that have particular social obligations based on licensing and or social norms as part of that system, and their obligation then is to provide patient optimal medical care.
So what we had talked about, and again, this may not be relevant or convincing to anybody else, but what is the difference? And I don't mean to sound silly. What is the difference between going to a doctor and following a computer algorithm? And we had a lot of conversations about that, because part of what one would like learning to do, particularly as we had more pragmatic trials that really include people with comorbidities in our evidence making and all that, is to have a lot more data and ultimately to have good guidance about a ton more stuff than we do right now. So maybe people say, well, we only need doctors in the interim so we get to all the good data. Maybe there's a view that once you get even a lot more data, there is still a role for an informed physician who has read a lot of that stuff to play a role in helping you achieve what you care about and what counts as best interest for you.
Couldn't agree more.
But you still say that falls under 3.
But I don't think that has anything to do with, I don't think it falls under 3 completely.
Yeah, I guess more a question of whether it needs to be highlighted.
But I think having 2 in there really distorts the center of what this is supposed to be about.
Yeah.
Which is
the one other thing I'll tell you is an anecdote, and I don't, I'm just going to have to go back and think more about whether we gave this too much weight. Peter Pronovost talked about 2 all the time, and I think he was saying that as something he hears all the time. That he basically spends his life going in and trying to put systems in place and saying to doctors, there's now going to be a pop-up reminder that happens on the computer screen. There's now going to be the nurse reminding you to wash your hands. There's now going to be the extra person there. We're now telling you how you have to write your medication order so that they're consistent. He's sort of mucking around with how they do care all the time. And I think he's always, this is now anecdotal, getting some kind of pushback all the time. It's like, but so I think he very much thought it was important to say, look, we still know you guys are out there. We still value your expertise. We think you have an important role.
Well,
there's still a lot of this in there.
selling point. That's a sock. That's a sock. That doesn't belong in selling point.
I think the selling point is actually crucial, because I think there's as you've been talking, I've been thinking about the engineering that's behind this, or how to get this into practice. Yeah. And for instance, there's a duty. Number 8 is everybody should be honest. That's not on this list. And you talked a lot about certainty. You talked a lot. There's a lot of stuff here about people should be honest. Well, why aren't they honest? Well, because there are all these countervailing forces and malpractice, and we have the wrong language for uncertainty. We're not allowed to be uncertain. So there's a lot of stuff, engineering-wise, in the environment that doesn't let us do this separately from what. So then I start thinking, okay, what are the forces in play that don't allow the proper vision to go on the one hand? Number 2 is, how do you sell the product on the other hand? And number 3, and I do think that number 2 is part of the selling and the engineering of this. The 4th end is, and you bring up computers a lot. I'm not going to go on about computers, but
a lot.
Yeah, right. And there's a lot to say about that. But the flip side is, wait a minute, can we re-engineer the system so it makes it easier to do this? For instance, I just think about attestation versus consent. Let's say you had a little project that was kind of low risk, and you had a little checkbox, and you say, as the investigator, I attest that this is low risk, and therefore I don't have to go through IRB approval. Yeah. But if somebody calls me up and says, by the way, this is no way in hell this is so. That might be a way of and in a computer-based environment that becomes easier. So I think there's an interesting interaction between the ethical duties on the one hand and the engineering of this thing. And if you think about it, having the piece of paper, informed consent piece of paper, is an engineering kind of activity, is what reshaped the whole bioethics field in the first place. So I think there's
along with the IRB oversight, having the center.
But that mechanism is an interesting interaction between what we say is ethical and the mechanisms we have to be effective.
Yeah.
I'm not a scholar to know what that all is, but I'm struck by we have a moment things are changing. The system itself is changing dramatically.
Yeah.
How will that change the way we engineer it?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad. So I struggled with which pieces to put up here. The one maybe key piece that I omitted completely from this presentation is so what do we do with this? Right. Next steps. And we are nascent in that thinking. However, one piece that we did write about a little bit in these papers that I hope are almost impressed with, not quite there, is, I think, exactly what you're talking about, which is we would like to argue that there will be a large body of learning activities that can be defined, and you can have a lot of description about if they meet these criteria and don't meet any of these, they ought to be able to go forward not only without any informed consent, but without any systematic, every single activity, third-party committee oversight. There ought to be random audits to ensure that people aren't just checking boxes so they can escape the system, bypass the system, but if it's really working the right way, these are things that are not changing your care, are protecting your confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they ought to be able to bypass all of this in the context of wide disclosure through a lot of creative mechanisms to let the patient population know learning is going on continuously and how it works, and there's a website they can go to if they want to know what all the learning activities are in September 2012. So there are ways to be transparent and let people know, but triage what needs both third-party review oversight and individual informed consent oversight. And there's a bunch of other stuff where all these what I'll call traditional oversight mechanisms kick into place. So it's very much what you're saying. At least just,
no, we desperately need this. We desperately need this. We need that framework.
Yeah, it looks like this.
I'm sorry to be the bad guy.
No. This is great.
Our hour's up, but this was really provocative. Obviously, we got a lot of engagement, and thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you.
I feel lucky we had you. Thank you.